Okay, welcome back to part three, and I believe the last part of our lecture on composition and page structure. Keep in mind that there will be more lectures on composition in general. I'm um, just in terms of this one topic related to composition. There is more to talk about other than sometimes I think students they hear this lecture and they feel like that's it. That's what composition is all about. It's all about corner diagonals, midpoints, centers, and perfect measurements of thirds. But there are other things. Composition it's a much bigger topic than just that. But I think it's a good place to start. So one of the things I wanted to say about Baroque composition that is kind of distinctly different from a lot of the other composition that we see is there's a lot of use of this particular structure. A heavy reliance in one way, like on one corner to corner diagonal. But then in the other direction, not really much reliance on this corner to corner diagonal. Instead, more reliance on these diagonals. A diagonal from the corner to the first line that meets at a right angle. And then from the corner, whoops, let me go back. I clicked. From the corner to that line meeting at a right angle. So I put that measurement in, and then I also thought was really interesting that if you continued this line, which I started over again right there, it's almost parallel to it, you would see that that lines up very carefully with these set of diagonals that these characters are organized on. I also was looking at how the corner to corner diagonal for the whole unit, and this is an interesting thing to think about for those of you when you are actually analyzing this painting, that this center panel here has its own compositional rules based on its geometry, but then it is also related to the bigger composition of the whole panel, right? The triptych, because it's a multi-panel, it's an altarpiece, and therefore when it's opened up, you see all three of these paintings together. I also put down this measurement, which is almost a perfect third, but not quite, I don't think. I'd have to actually get a ruler out to be certain of that. And you can see how this also kind of lines up as these almost going from center, right? From the center point, they're kind of like similar to this type of diagonal, going from the center corner there to that corner, meeting at a right angle, and how that seems to be a thing that that Rubens was thinking about, at least in this particular painting. That's not that common from what I can tell from the analysis I've done, but definitely this type of structure, corner and then this type of right angle and that type of right angle, is a very, very common structure in a lot of Baroque painting. So now we're going to look at some other ones. In the Romantic period, we see similarly, we see an interest in geometry and a kind of a return to an interest in triangles. But unlike the use of triangles in the Renaissance, we see much more an interest in kind of these more moving triangles, right? They create sense, so they're not triangles lining up in the middle so much as they're triangles that push, to one direction or the other. In this case, what Jericho is doing is he's kind of almost splitting the raft in half, like creating a sense of how like the forces of the water are kind of ripping things apart. So it's like everything is pushing this way, but then there are also forces pushing that way. More things are pushing this way, which is also where most of the people are looking and where the boat is on the other side of that horizon. So that makes sense. Here are some other analyses. I also included the little tan version of it just because I thought it was funny. But one of the things I've said before, and I want to emphasize again, that I think one of the things that works in this painting, similarly to a Baroque painting, is how it's pairing two types of composition. One type of composition is very geometric and careful, and then another type of composition is more sinuous, more organic. It's all these curves that interlock and flow into each other. And it's the interplay between those two that really makes the composition complex and interesting. Here's another version. This time the triangle has got more dynamic movement. It's much more pushing, right? Because it's just slightly, it's pretty close to a third, but I think that's actually a little bit closer to the center. I actually think that it being off from the third is part of what makes it so dynamic. Also, this diagonal I think is pretty important, which is once again very close to a kind of 2/3 to 1/3 diagonal. And now we're starting to look at more modernist compositions, and we're really starting to look at the issue of dissonance, right? And how I think in the Degas, this is both a very carefully composed and very quietly composed image, and yet at the same time, there's just a little bit of energy and tension to it. And that energy and tension comes from like these close proximities, like the way certain things come really close to the edge, right? Or kind of like uncomfortably close to the edge. It's really kind of like, or like the way this diagonal is so close to that measurement, to the fourth measurement right there, right? That's the demarcation of a perfect fourth right there. And so there's this kind of play between being structured and composed versus playing off of that structure to make dissonance and tension. We can see that a lot in the work of someone like Francis Bacon. And I am running out of time, so I'm going to have to go through this a little bit fast. But the main thing I want to point out is that the tension in these images is not just about the imagery, right? There's other things. There are compositional decisions, such as the flatness, the dry flatness of some of the paint, and then the heavy impasto of some other parts of the paint. But a lot of it is also having to do with the geometries, how things come close to lining up, but then don't quite, like that corner being off, right? All these things being really close to perfect points, but then not quite, is a major kind of part of the way Francis Bacon composed. Here's some more examples, right? Like I think this one feels more composed, but even still, where the dog is centered, right? It's not centered in a normal spot like that. Location just kind of under the neck, between the neck and the shoulder, is this. It's kind of a weird off location. Here's another example, and this is another one where I'm showing you both with the diagonals, with the geometry laid in, and without, because I really want you to see how once you start looking for the geometry, you can really see that there was some careful compositional decisions at play here, right? Thinking about how things line up. And I put both lines, like both the kind of perfect geometric lines, like the corner to corner diagonal, as well, and like that corner to corner diagonal, as well as the lines that are off from that, like this kind of diagonal and that diagonal, and then this other diagonal, because I wanted you to see how it plays off of that. But then when you see it without, you can see how it both allows the painting to feel kind of structured, especially when you start to examine it for a long period, but to also give it this very kind of open-ended feeling, like you don't, and like they're kind of unmoored as to how to read it. Okay, so that's pretty much the end of the lecture. I ended on this Annie Leibovitz spread. I don't think there's, yeah, that's it. So hopefully you now can kind of see how this does have a real effect in art, right? People use this to create a sense of a structure to their compositions, and it can be used sometimes by some artists as a way of making things feel ordered, composed, quiet, and kind of timeless and unmoving. And it can be used by other artists to create tension, create a sense of movement. That's my 9-minute warning. So anyway, that's where we are. So we're going to end right there. Thank you very much.